You know, there are some stories that stick with you long after you've heard them. Stories that make you question the very nature of human obsession, the price of ambition, and how quickly tragedy can transform into spectacle. Today, I want to share with you one of the most haunting tales from American history. A story that began with a man's dream of discovery and ended in a nightmare that captivated an entire nation. This is the story of Floyd Collins, a cave explorer whose death became one of the first major media sensations of the 20th century. It's a tale that reveals the darkest aspects of human nature, where genuine heroism collided with shameless exploitation, and where a man's final moments became entertainment for millions. Now, let me take you back to 1925 to the rolling hills of south-central Kentucky, where beneath the green pastures and tobacco fields lay one of the most extensive cave systems in the world. It was here, in this landscape of hidden wonders and deadly secrets, that Floyd Collins would meet his fate in a way that would haunt the American consciousness for generations to come. Picture, if you will, the sensation of being trapped in absolute darkness, your body wedged so tightly in stone that every breath becomes a struggle, while above you, the entire world watches and waits. This is not just a story about caving, or even about death. This is a story about what happens when human tragedy becomes public entertainment, and how the line between rescue and exploitation can disappear entirely. The year 1925 was a time of rapid change in America. Radio was bringing distant voices into living rooms across the country, automobiles were transforming how people traveled, and a new phenomenon called mass media was beginning to shape public consciousness in ways no one fully understood. Into this world of emerging connectivity and instant communication stepped Floyd Collins, a man whose personal tragedy would become the first true media circus of the modern age. But to understand how Floyd Collins became trapped in Sand Cave and why his story resonated so powerfully with the American public, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand the man behind the headlines, the world he inhabited, and the forces that drove him into the depths of the earth on that fateful February morning. Floyd Collins was born into a world where the boundary between surface and underground was fluid, where families made their living from both the soil above and the mysteries below. The Collins family farm sat in the heart of Kentucky's cave country, where limestone bedrock had been carved by millions of years of flowing water into an intricate network of passages, chambers, and underground rivers. William Floyd Collins came into this world on July 20th, 1887, the third of 9 children born to Lee and Martha Collins. The Collins family farm was located in the Mammoth Cave region of Kentucky, an area that would later become famous worldwide for its extensive cave systems. But in Floyd's youth, these underground wonders were largely unknown to the outside world, hidden beneath the feet of farmers who worked the land above without fully comprehending the vast emptiness that lay beneath. Lee Collins was a hard-working farmer who struggled to make ends meet on the rocky soil of south-central Kentucky. The land was challenging, with thin topsoil covering the limestone bedrock that characterized the region. Crops were often poor, and the family frequently found themselves scraping by on whatever they could coax from the reluctant earth. It was this economic hardship that would eventually drive the Collins family to look underground for their salvation. Young Floyd was different from his siblings from an early age. While his brothers and sisters seemed content with the rhythms of farm life, Floyd was drawn to the mysterious openings that appeared in the landscape around their property. Sinkholes, cave entrances, and underground streams fascinated him in a way that worried his parents and puzzled his neighbors. Where others saw dangerous holes in the ground to be avoided, Floyd saw gateways to adventure. His first real cave exploration came when he was just 12 years old. A sinkhole had opened up near the family's property line, and while most people would have simply filled it in or fenced it off, Floyd convinced his father to let him investigate. Armed with nothing more than a kerosene lantern and a rope, the boy descended into his first cave. What he found there changed the course of his life forever. The cave was small by Kentucky standards, just a series of connected chambers that extended perhaps 100 feet underground. But for young Floyd, it might as well have been an alien world. The silence was unlike anything he had ever experienced, not the quiet of a still night, but the profound absence of sound that exists only in the deep earth. The air was cool and humid, carrying scents of wet limestone and ancient water. Most remarkably, the cave seemed to breathe, with subtle air currents that suggested connections to larger systems hidden somewhere in the darkness beyond his lantern's reach. From that moment forward, Floyd Collins was a changed person. He began seeking out every cave entrance he could find, mapping passages in his head, and developing an intuitive understanding of how water moved through limestone. His family initially viewed this obsession with a mixture of amusement and concern. Cave exploration was not considered a respectable pursuit in rural Kentucky. It was dangerous, dirty work that served no obvious practical purpose. But Floyd's passion went beyond mere adventure seeking. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the underground landscape. He could predict where passages would lead, sense the presence of larger chambers beyond narrow restrictions, and navigate complex cave systems with an accuracy that amazed even experienced cavers. Local people began to whisper that Floyd Collins had some kind of special connection to the underground world, that he could feel the caves calling to him. As Floyd entered his teenage years, his cave exploration became more systematic and ambitious. He began keeping detailed notes about the caves he discovered, sketching rough maps, and developing techniques for navigating particularly challenging passages. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of larger cave systems, the way air moved through small openings, the sound of distant water, the particular quality of echo that suggested vast hidden chambers. The Collins family's financial situation remained precarious throughout Floyd's youth. The farm provided a subsistence living at best, and Lee Collins was constantly looking for ways to supplement the family's income. It was during this period that the family first became aware of the commercial potential of the caves that lay beneath their property. Other families in the region had begun charging visitors to tour particularly spectacular cave systems, and some were making substantial profits from what had previously been considered worthless holes in the ground. This realization would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the Collins family. On one hand, it provided a potential solution to their financial problems. On the other hand, it transformed Floyd's passion for cave exploration into a commercial enterprise, adding pressure and urgency to what had previously been a pure pursuit of discovery. Floyd's formal education was limited, as was common for rural children of his era. He attended the local one-room schoolhouse sporadically, but his real education took place underground. He learned geology by touch, hydrology by observation, and physics through the practical challenges of moving through tight spaces and navigating vertical drops. His teachers were the caves themselves, and they taught him lessons that no classroom could provide. By the time Floyd reached adulthood, he had explored more caves in the Mammoth Cave region than perhaps any other individual. He had developed a reputation as someone who could find cave entrances where others saw only solid ground, and who could navigate underground systems that defeated more experienced explorers. Local people began seeking him out when they suspected caves might exist on their property, and Floyd was always eager to investigate. The transition from hobby to profession happened gradually. At first, Floyd simply helped neighbors explore caves on their land, accepting small payments for his services. But as word of his abilities spread, he began to receive requests from farther afield. Property owners throughout the region wanted to know if they might be sitting on top of commercially viable cave systems, and Floyd Collins became the person they turned to for answers. This growing reputation brought Floyd into contact with the emerging cave tourism industry that was beginning to develop in Kentucky. Mammoth Cave, the largest known cave system in the region, had been attracting visitors since the early 1800s. But by the 1920s, competition was fierce among cave owners who wanted to capture some of the tourist dollars that Mammoth Cave was generating. The stage was being set for what would later be known as the Kentucky Cave Wars, a period of intense competition among cave owners that would ultimately lead Floyd Collins to make the fateful decision that cost him his life. But to understand those events, we need to examine the strange world of commercial cave exploration that was emerging in Kentucky during the early decades of the 20th century. The Kentucky Cave Wars were not a military conflict in any traditional sense, but rather an economic battle fought with advertising, legal maneuvering, and increasingly desperate attempts to discover new cave systems that could compete with the established tourist attractions. At the center of this conflict was Mammoth Cave, which had been drawing visitors from around the world since the early 19th century. Mammoth Cave was and remains one of the most spectacular cave systems on Earth. Its vast chambers, intricate formations, and seemingly endless passages had made it famous throughout America and Europe. Wealthy tourists would travel hundreds of miles to experience the underground wonders of Kentucky, and the owners of Mammoth Cave were reaping substantial profits from this natural attraction. But Mammoth Cave's success had not gone unnoticed by other property owners in the region. Throughout the limestone hills of south-central Kentucky, farmers and landowners began to wonder if they might be sitting on top of their own underground gold mines. The geology of the region suggested that extensive cave systems were likely to exist throughout the area, and the potential profits from cave tourism were too attractive to ignore. This led to a period of intense cave exploration and development throughout the region. Property owners hired explorers like Floyd Collins to investigate potential cave systems on their land. New caves were discovered regularly, and many were developed into tourist attractions with varying degrees of success. Some featured spectacular formations or unusual geological features that could compete with Mammoth Cave's attractions. Others were little more than holes in the ground dressed up with wooden walkways and electric lighting. The competition became increasingly fierce as more caves entered the market. Cave owners engaged in aggressive advertising campaigns, making increasingly extravagant claims about the wonders that awaited visitors to their particular underground attractions. Roadside signs proliferated throughout the region, each promising the most spectacular cave experience available. Tour guides were trained to disparage competing caves while promoting the unique features of their own systems. Floyd Collins found himself at the center of this commercial cave boom. His reputation as a cave finder and explorer made him a valuable asset to property owners who hoped to discover the next great tourist attraction. He was hired to explore potential cave systems throughout the region, and his discoveries helped fuel the growing competition among cave owners. But Floyd's relationship with the commercial cave industry was complicated. While he appreciated the income that his exploration work provided, he remained fundamentally motivated by the pure joy of discovery rather than commercial considerations. He was happiest when he was alone underground, pushing through unexplored passages and mapping new sections of cave systems. The commercial pressures and competitive atmosphere of the cave tourism industry sometimes conflicted with his more scientific approach to exploration. The Collins family had their own stake in the cave tourism business. They owned and operated Crystal Cave, a modest but attractive cave system located on their property. Crystal Cave featured some beautiful formations and interesting geological features, but it struggled to compete with the larger and more spectacular caves in the region. The family's income from Crystal Cave was irregular and insufficient to provide financial security. This economic pressure weighed heavily on Floyd Collins. He felt responsible for his family's financial well-being, and he was constantly searching for ways to improve Crystal Cave's commercial prospects. He explored every passage of the cave system, looking for new chambers or formations that might attract more visitors. He also continued to search for entirely new cave systems that might provide the Collins family with a more profitable tourist attraction. It was this search for a new cave system that would ultimately lead Floyd Collins to Sand Cave. In early 1925, Floyd had been investigating a small opening in the ground on property owned by a local farmer named B. Doyle. The opening was unpromising, just a narrow crack in the limestone that seemed to lead nowhere. But Floyd's experienced eye detected subtle signs that suggested the presence of a larger cave system below. The property where Sand Cave was located was strategically positioned along one of the main roads leading to Mammoth Cave. Floyd recognized that a cave in this location could potentially intercept tourists on their way to the more famous attraction. If he could discover and develop a spectacular cave system here, it could provide the financial breakthrough that his family desperately needed. Floyd's initial explorations of the Sand Cave opening were encouraging. The narrow entrance led to a series of small chambers and passages that showed signs of continuing deeper underground. More importantly, Floyd detected air currents and sounds that suggested the presence of much larger chambers somewhere below. His instincts told him that this small, unpromising opening might be the gateway to a major cave system. The challenge was that the passages leading deeper into the cave were extremely narrow and difficult to navigate. Floyd was a small man, standing only about 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing perhaps 140 pounds, but even he found the passages challenging. The route to the deeper sections of the cave required squeezing through openings barely large enough for a human body, crawling through passages filled with loose sand and gravel, and navigating tight turns that made it difficult to retreat if problems arose. Despite these challenges, Floyd was convinced that Sand Cave held the key to his family's financial future. He began making regular trips to the cave, each time pushing a little deeper into the system and mapping the passages he discovered. He was methodical in his approach, carefully noting the direction and size of each passage and looking for signs that might indicate the presence of larger chambers ahead. The work was exhausting and dangerous. The passages were so narrow that Floyd often had to remove his jacket and sometimes even his shirt to squeeze through tight spots. The loose sand and gravel that filled many of the passages made movement difficult and created the constant risk of cave-ins. The air quality was poor in some sections, and Floyd sometimes emerged from his explorations gasping for breath and covered in mud and sand. But Floyd's determination was unwavering. He was convinced that somewhere ahead, beyond the narrow passages and challenging obstacles, lay a cave system that would rival anything in Kentucky. He could feel it in the way the air moved through the passages, hear it in the distant sounds that echoed from the depths, and sense it in the subtle geological signs that only an experienced cave explorer would recognize. On February 1st, 1925, Floyd Collins made what would prove to be his final descent into Sand Cave. He had been working in the cave for several weeks, gradually pushing deeper into the system and making steady progress toward what he believed would be a major discovery. On this particular morning, he was planning to explore a passage that he had been working to enlarge for several days. The passage in question was located about 55 feet from the cave entrance, at a depth of approximately 15 feet below the surface. It was a tight squeeze even by Floyd's standards, requiring him to lie on his back and push himself forward with his feet while using his hands to pull himself along. The passage was filled with loose sand and gravel, and Floyd had been gradually clearing debris to make the route more passable. Floyd entered the cave that morning carrying his usual equipment, a kerosene lantern for light, some basic tools for moving rocks and debris, and a small amount of food and water. He was dressed in his typical cave exploration outfit, old work clothes that he didn't mind getting dirty, and sturdy boots that provided good traction on wet limestone surfaces. The first part of his journey into the cave proceeded normally. Floyd navigated the familiar passages with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route dozens of times before. He reached the tight passage that had been his focus for the past several days and began the careful process of squeezing through the narrow opening. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for decades to come. According to Floyd's own later account, he was lying on his back in the narrow passage, pushing himself forward with his feet, when a large rock became dislodged from the ceiling above him. The rock, estimated to weigh about 27 pounds, fell directly onto Floyd's left leg, pinning it against the floor of the passage. The position Floyd found himself in was nightmarish beyond description. He was lying on his back in a passage so narrow that he could barely move his arms. His left leg was pinned beneath a heavy rock that he could not move or dislodge. The passage was too narrow for him to turn around, and the rock made it impossible for him to retreat the way he had come. He was trapped in a space barely large enough for his body, in complete darkness except for the flickering light of his kerosene lantern. Floyd's initial reaction was not panic, but rather the methodical problem-solving approach that had served him well in countless previous cave explorations. He carefully assessed his situation, testing the limits of his movement and examining the rock that had pinned his leg. The rock was wedged tightly against both his leg and the passage wall, creating a trap that seemed almost deliberately designed to hold him in place. The physical discomfort was immediate and severe. The rock was pressing against his leg with tremendous force, cutting off circulation and causing intense pain. The narrow passage meant that Floyd could not shift his weight or find a more comfortable position. Every movement sent waves of agony through his trapped leg, and he quickly realized that struggling would only make his situation worse. But perhaps more terrifying than the physical pain was the psychological impact of his predicament. Floyd Collins, who had spent his entire adult life exploring caves and navigating underground challenges, found himself in a situation that his experience and expertise could not solve. He was trapped in a way that made rescue extremely difficult, if not impossible, and he was completely dependent on others for his survival. The hours that followed Floyd's entrapment were a study in human endurance and determination. Despite the pain and the growing realization of how serious his situation was, Floyd remained remarkably calm and focused. He conserved his energy, rationed his limited food and water, and began calling for help in the hope that someone might hear him from the surface. Floyd's calls for help went unanswered for many hours. Sand Cave was located in a relatively remote area, and it was not unusual for Floyd to spend entire days underground without anyone expecting to see him. His family was accustomed to his long cave exploration trips, and they would not begin to worry about his absence until he failed to return home that evening. As the hours passed, Floyd's situation became increasingly desperate. The kerosene in his lantern was burning low, threatening to leave him in complete darkness. The cold, damp air of the cave was sapping his body heat, and he could feel himself becoming weaker as time went on. Most seriously, the circulation in his trapped leg was severely compromised, and he was beginning to lose feeling in his foot. It was not until the evening of February 1st that Floyd's absence was noticed. When he failed to return home for dinner, his family initially assumed that he had simply lost track of time while working in the cave. But as the hours passed and there was still no sign of Floyd, his brother Homer Collins began to worry. Homer knew about Floyd's work at Sand Cave, and he decided to investigate. Homer Collins arrived at Sand Cave around 10 o'clock that evening, calling out for his brother as he approached the cave entrance. To his relief, he heard Floyd's voice responding from somewhere deep within the cave, but his relief quickly turned to alarm when Floyd explained his situation. Homer immediately realized that this was not a problem that could be solved quickly or easily. Homer's first instinct was to enter the cave and attempt to free his brother directly. But when he tried to navigate the narrow passages that led to Floyd's location, he quickly discovered that he was too large to reach the spot where Floyd was trapped. The passages that Floyd had been able to navigate with difficulty were simply impassable for Homer's larger frame. This discovery added a new dimension to the crisis. Not only was Floyd trapped in an extremely difficult location, but the very narrowness of the passages that had allowed him to reach that location now prevented potential rescuers from reaching him. Any rescue attempt would have to be conducted by someone small enough to navigate the tight passages, and even then, the logistics of freeing Floyd and getting him out of the cave would be enormously challenging. Homer spent several hours at the cave that night, talking to Floyd through the narrow passages and trying to assess the situation. Floyd remained remarkably calm and coherent, providing detailed descriptions of his predicament and offering suggestions for how he might be freed. But it was clear to both brothers that this was beyond their ability to handle alone. Professional help would be needed. The next morning, Homer Collins began spreading word of Floyd's predicament throughout the local community. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Cave exploration was a common activity in the region, and many local people had experience with underground rescue operations. Within hours, a steady stream of volunteers was arriving at Sand Cave, eager to help with the rescue effort. The early rescue attempts were characterized by enthusiasm and good intentions, but also by a lack of coordination and expertise. Local farmers, cave guides, and amateur explorers all offered their services, but few had experience with the kind of technical rescue operation that Floyd's situation required. The narrow passages leading to Floyd's location meant that only the smallest volunteers could even attempt to reach him, and even they found the journey extremely difficult. One of the first serious rescue attempts was made by a local cave guide named Johnny Gerald. Gerald was small enough to navigate the passages leading to Floyd, and he had enough cave experience to understand the challenges involved. When Gerald finally reached Floyd's location, he was shocked by what he found. Floyd was conscious and alert, but clearly weakening after more than 24 hours of entrapment. The rock pinning his leg was larger and more firmly wedged than anyone had realized, and the passage was so narrow that there was virtually no room to work. Gerald spent several hours with Floyd, trying various methods to free the trapped leg. He attempted to dig around the rock, to lever it up with tools, and to break it into smaller pieces, but every effort failed. The rock was too heavy and too firmly wedged to be moved by one person working in such a confined space. Worse, Gerald's efforts seemed to be causing the rock to settle more firmly into place, making Floyd's situation even more precarious. The failure of these initial rescue attempts led to a growing realization that Floyd's predicament was far more serious than anyone had initially understood. This was not a simple matter of moving a rock or widening a passage. The entire approach to the rescue would need to be reconsidered, and professional expertise would be required. Word of Floyd Collins' entrapment began to spread beyond the immediate local community. Newspaper reporters, drawn by the human drama of the story, began arriving at Sand Cave to cover the rescue efforts. What they found was a story that seemed tailor-made for the emerging mass media of the 1920s. A brave explorer trapped underground, desperate rescue efforts, and a race against time that captured the public imagination. The media coverage of Floyd Collins' entrapment marked a turning point in American journalism and mass communication. For the first time, a local tragedy was transformed into a national obsession through the power of newspapers, radio, and the emerging technologies of mass media. The story had all the elements that would later become standard features of media sensations: human drama, life and death stakes, and a cast of colorful characters that the public could follow and identify with. The transformation of Floyd's rescue into a media spectacle began innocently enough. Local newspaper reporters arrived at Sand Cave to cover what they initially assumed would be a routine rescue story. But as the hours turned into days and the rescue efforts became increasingly complex and dramatic, the story began to attract attention from newspapers throughout Kentucky and the surrounding states. The first major newspaper to give the story significant coverage was the Louisville Courier-Journal, Kentucky's largest and most influential newspaper. The paper sent reporter William Burke Miller to cover the rescue efforts, and Miller's vivid, detailed reporting brought the drama of Sand Cave to readers throughout the region. Miller's articles combined technical details about the rescue efforts with human interest elements that made readers feel personally invested in Floyd's fate. Miller's reporting was groundbreaking in several ways. He was one of the first journalists to provide continuous, real-time coverage of a developing news story, filing multiple updates each day as the rescue efforts progressed. He also pioneered a style of immersive journalism that put readers directly into the scene, describing not just what was happening, but what it felt like to be there. His articles captured the sounds, smells, and atmosphere of the rescue site in a way that made distant readers feel as though they were witnessing the events firsthand. The success of Miller's coverage quickly attracted the attention of newspapers throughout the country. Within days of the initial reports, journalists from major cities across America were traveling to Kentucky to cover the Floyd Collins story. The rescue site, which had initially been visited only by local volunteers, was suddenly swarming with reporters, photographers, and radio broadcasters. This media attention had a profound impact on the rescue efforts themselves. What had begun as a local community response to a neighbor in distress was rapidly transformed into a national spectacle. The constant presence of reporters and photographers changed the dynamics of the rescue site, adding pressure on rescue workers to perform for the cameras and creating distractions that sometimes interfered with the actual rescue work. The media coverage also attracted thousands of curious spectators to Sand Cave. People traveled from hundreds of miles away to witness the rescue efforts firsthand, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that was both fascinating and disturbing. Vendors set up stands to sell food and souvenirs to the crowds. Entrepreneurs offered tours of the area and sold maps showing the location of Sand Cave. Local hotels and restaurants were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of visitors. The spectacle that developed around Sand Cave was unlike anything America had seen before. It was the first major news event of the radio age, and it demonstrated the power of mass media to transform local events into national obsessions. Radio stations provided regular updates on the rescue efforts, allowing people across the country to follow the story as it unfolded. Newspapers published special editions with the latest developments, and newsreel cameras captured footage that was shown in movie theaters nationwide. But perhaps most remarkably, the media coverage created a sense of personal connection between the American public and Floyd Collins himself. Through the detailed reporting of journalists like William Burke Miller, people who had never met Floyd felt as though they knew him personally. They followed every development in his condition, celebrated small victories in the rescue efforts, and agonized over setbacks and delays. This personal connection was fostered by the unique nature of Floyd's situation. Unlike other disasters or tragedies that might claim multiple victims, the Sand Cave story focused on a single individual whose personality and character could be explored in detail. Reporters interviewed Floyd's family members, friends, and neighbors, building a comprehensive picture of the man trapped underground. They described his passion for cave exploration, his devotion to his family, and his dreams of discovering a great cave system that would bring prosperity to his community. The media also provided detailed coverage of the conversations that rescue workers were able to have with Floyd through the narrow passages of the cave. These conversations, relayed to the public through newspaper articles and radio broadcasts, gave Floyd a voice in his own story and allowed the public to hear directly from the man whose fate they were following so closely. Floyd's calm demeanor, his concern for his rescuers' safety, and his unwavering optimism in the face of desperate circumstances made him a sympathetic and compelling figure. As the rescue efforts continued and Floyd's situation became increasingly desperate, the media coverage intensified. Newspapers began publishing multiple editions each day, with headlines that tracked every development in the story. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to provide updates on the rescue efforts. The story dominated front pages across the country, pushing aside other news events and capturing the attention of millions of Americans. The intensity of the media coverage created its own set of problems and complications. The constant presence of reporters and photographers at the rescue site made it difficult for rescue workers to do their jobs effectively. The crowds of spectators who were drawn to the area by the media coverage created logistical challenges and sometimes interfered with rescue operations. The pressure to provide constant updates to the media sometimes led to premature or inaccurate reports about the progress of rescue efforts. More troubling was the way that the media coverage began to take on a life of its own, separate from the actual rescue efforts. The story became as much about the spectacle surrounding the rescue as about Floyd Collins himself. Reporters began focusing on the carnival atmosphere at the rescue site, the colorful characters among the spectators and volunteers, and the broader social and cultural implications of the event. This shift in focus was perhaps inevitable, given the unprecedented nature of the media attention. The Floyd Collins story was breaking new ground in terms of how news events were covered and consumed by the American public. There were no established protocols or ethical guidelines for this kind of intensive, real-time coverage of a developing tragedy. Reporters and editors were making decisions about coverage on the fly, often without fully considering the implications of their choices. The commercialization of Floyd's tragedy was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the media circus that developed around Sand Cave. Entrepreneurs quickly recognized the profit potential in the thousands of visitors who were flocking to the area, and they moved quickly to capitalize on the situation. Souvenir stands appeared almost overnight, selling everything from postcards and photographs to pieces of rock allegedly taken from Sand Cave itself. Local businesses experienced a boom unlike anything they had ever seen. Hotels, restaurants, and gas stations were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of visitors. Some establishments raised their prices dramatically to take advantage of the captive market. Others struggled to keep up with demand, running out of food, gasoline, and other necessities as the crowds continued to grow. The transformation of Floyd's rescue into a commercial spectacle reached its peak with the establishment of what was essentially a temporary amusement park around Sand Cave. Carnival rides were brought in to entertain the crowds. Games of chance and skill were set up to separate visitors from their money. Food vendors sold everything from hot dogs and popcorn to more elaborate meals. The atmosphere became increasingly festive and carnival-like, creating a surreal contrast with the life and death drama playing out underground. This commercialization of tragedy was deeply disturbing to many observers, including members of Floyd's own family. They watched in horror as their loved one's suffering was transformed into entertainment and profit for others. The Collins family received little benefit from the commercial activity surrounding the rescue, while strangers made money from Floyd's misfortune. The ethical implications of the media coverage and commercialization of Floyd's rescue were largely ignored at the time, but they would later be recognized as important precedents in the development of modern media ethics. The Floyd Collins story demonstrated both the power and the potential dangers of mass media coverage of personal tragedies. It showed how quickly genuine human drama could be transformed into entertainment, and how the line between news reporting and exploitation could become blurred. As the rescue efforts entered their second week, the initial optimism that had characterized the early attempts to free Floyd began to give way to a more somber realization of the challenges involved. The narrow passages leading to Floyd's location made it virtually impossible to bring in the heavy equipment that might be needed to move the rock pinning his leg. The constant stream of rescue workers and spectators was causing the cave passages to become increasingly unstable, raising the risk of additional cave-ins that could make Floyd's situation even worse. The rescue efforts had evolved into a complex operation involving multiple teams working on different approaches simultaneously. One team continued to work on the original plan of trying to free Floyd directly by removing or breaking the rock that pinned his leg. Another team began digging a vertical shaft that would allow rescuers to reach Floyd from above, bypassing the narrow horizontal passages that had proven so problematic. A third team explored the possibility of finding alternative routes into the cave system that might provide easier access to Floyd's location. Each of these approaches faced significant challenges and limitations. The direct rescue efforts were hampered by the extremely confined working conditions and the risk of causing additional cave-ins. The vertical shaft project was a massive undertaking that would require moving tons of earth and rock, and there was no guarantee that the shaft could be completed in time to save Floyd's life. The search for alternative cave entrances had so far been unsuccessful, and time was running out. As the days passed, Floyd's physical condition began to deteriorate noticeably. The cold, damp conditions in the cave were sapping his strength, and the lack of adequate food and water was taking its toll. The circulation in his trapped leg had been severely compromised for over a week, and there were growing concerns about infection and gangrene. Most seriously, Floyd was beginning to show signs of delirium and confusion, suggesting that his mental state was being affected by his prolonged ordeal. The conversations that rescue workers were able to have with Floyd became increasingly precious as his condition worsened. These brief exchanges, conducted through the narrow passages of the cave, provided the only direct contact between Floyd and the outside world. Rescue workers would crawl through the tight passages to reach a point where they could speak with Floyd, bringing him small amounts of food and water and providing updates on the rescue efforts. These conversations revealed Floyd's remarkable courage and determination in the face of his desperate situation. Despite his deteriorating condition and the growing realization that his chances of survival were diminishing, Floyd remained concerned primarily with the welfare of his rescuers and the impact his situation was having on his family. He repeatedly urged rescue workers not to take unnecessary risks on his behalf, and he expressed gratitude for their efforts even as his own hope began to fade. The psychological impact of Floyd's situation on his rescuers and family members was profound. Many of the volunteers who worked on the rescue efforts were deeply affected by their brief encounters with Floyd in the cave. They were struck by his calm demeanor and his concern for others, even in the face of his own desperate circumstances. Some rescue workers later reported that their conversations with Floyd had changed their perspective on life and death, courage, and sacrifice. Floyd's family members were under enormous stress as they watched their loved one's condition deteriorate while the entire world looked on. They were grateful for the outpouring of support and assistance from volunteers and well-wishers, but they were also overwhelmed by the media attention and the carnival atmosphere that had developed around the rescue site. The constant presence of reporters and photographers made it difficult for them to grieve privately or to process their emotions without public scrutiny. The pressure on rescue coordinators and officials was also intense. They were responsible for making life and death decisions under the glare of national media attention, with millions of Americans following every development in the story. The technical challenges of the rescue were complicated by the need to manage public expectations and to coordinate the efforts of hundreds of volunteers and professionals who had converged on Sand Cave. As Floyd's condition continued to deteriorate, difficult decisions had to be made about the direction of the rescue efforts. The direct attempts to free Floyd by removing the rock had proven unsuccessful, and there were growing concerns that continued efforts along these lines might cause additional cave-ins that could kill Floyd instantly. The vertical shaft project was making progress, but it was unclear whether it could be completed in time to make a difference. On February 13th, 12 days after Floyd had become trapped, rescue workers made their last successful contact with him. Floyd was barely conscious, and his responses were weak and confused. He was suffering from severe dehydration, hypothermia, and what appeared to be the early stages of pneumonia. The circulation in his trapped leg had been cut off for so long that gangrene was almost certainly setting in. Most heartbreakingly, Floyd seemed to understand that his situation was hopeless, but he continued to express concern for his rescuers and gratitude for their efforts. The final conversation between Floyd and his rescuers was brief and heartbreaking. When asked how he was feeling, Floyd whispered that he was getting weaker and that he didn't think he could hold on much longer. He asked the rescue worker to tell his family that he loved them and that he was sorry for all the trouble he had caused. He also expressed hope that his death might serve some purpose, perhaps by leading to improved safety measures for cave explorers, or by bringing attention to the need for better rescue equipment and techniques. After February 13th, rescue workers were unable to get any response from Floyd, despite repeated attempts to communicate with him. The silence from the depths of Sand Cave was ominous and heartbreaking. Rescue efforts continued, but they were now focused on recovering Floyd's body rather than saving his life. The vertical shaft project continued, driven partly by the hope that Floyd might still be alive, and partly by the need to provide closure for his family and the millions of Americans who had been following his story. The vertical shaft was completed on February 17th, 16 days after Floyd had become trapped. When rescue workers finally reached Floyd's location through the new route, they found what they had feared. Floyd Collins was dead, apparently having succumbed to his injuries and the harsh conditions in the cave several days earlier. The exact time of his death could not be determined, but medical experts estimated that he had probably died on February 13th or 14th, around the time of his last communication with rescuers. The confirmation of Floyd's death sent shockwaves through the crowd of spectators that had gathered at Sand Cave and across the nation that had been following his story. For 16 days, millions of Americans had hoped and prayed for Floyd's rescue. They had followed every development in the story, celebrated small victories, and agonized over setbacks. The news of his death felt like a personal loss to many people who had never met him, but had come to feel connected to his struggle. The immediate aftermath of Floyd's death was marked by a complex mixture of grief, relief, and confusion. The rescue workers who had labored for more than 2 weeks to save Floyd's life were exhausted and emotionally drained. Many of them had formed a personal connection to Floyd through their brief conversations with him in the cave, and his death felt like a personal failure despite the heroic efforts they had made on his behalf. Floyd's family was devastated by his death, but they were also grateful that his suffering had finally ended. The past 16 days had been an emotional roller coaster for them, with moments of hope alternating with periods of despair. The constant media attention had made it difficult for them to process their grief privately, and they looked forward to being able to mourn their loved one away from the glare of public scrutiny. But the Collins family's ordeal was far from over. In fact, some of the most disturbing chapters of the Floyd Collins story were yet to be written. The death of Floyd Collins marked the end of the rescue efforts, but it was the beginning of a series of events that would prove even more troubling than the original tragedy. The first challenge facing the Collins family was the question of how to recover Floyd's body from Sand Cave. The vertical shaft that had been dug to reach Floyd's location was not suitable for removing his body, and the original route through the narrow horizontal passages was obviously impossible. The rock that had pinned Floyd's leg was still in place, and his body was wedged tightly in the narrow passage where he had died. Initial attempts to recover Floyd's body through the vertical shaft were unsuccessful. The passage was too narrow, and the body was positioned in such a way that it could not be easily moved. Rescue workers tried various approaches, including attempts to widen the passage and to break up the rock that had originally trapped Floyd. But these efforts were hampered by the unstable condition of the cave and the risk of additional cave-ins. As days turned into weeks, it became clear that recovering Floyd's body would be a major undertaking that might take months to complete. The Collins family was faced with the heartbreaking prospect of leaving their loved one's remains in the cave indefinitely, while engineers and cave experts developed a plan for safe recovery. This situation created a new set of problems and controversies. The media attention that had focused on the rescue efforts now shifted to the body recovery operation, prolonging the circus atmosphere at Sand Cave. Spectators continued to flock to the site, drawn by morbid curiosity about the location where Floyd had died. The commercialization of the tragedy continued, with vendors selling souvenirs and entrepreneurs offering tours of the area. More troubling was the emergence of various schemes and proposals for exploiting Floyd's death for commercial purposes. Some individuals suggested that Sand Cave should be developed as a tourist attraction, with Floyd's body left in place as a macabre centerpiece. Others proposed moving Floyd's body to a more accessible location, where it could be displayed for paying visitors. These suggestions were deeply offensive to the Collins family, but they reflected the extent to which Floyd's tragedy had been commercialized. The Collins family found themselves in an impossible situation. They desperately wanted to recover Floyd's body and give him a proper burial, but they lacked the financial resources to fund the complex recovery operation that would be required. They were also under pressure from various individuals and organizations who wanted to exploit Floyd's death for commercial or publicity purposes. The situation became even more complicated when questions arose about the ownership of Sand Cave and the rights to Floyd's body. The cave was located on property owned by B. Doyle, who had originally hired Floyd to explore the cave system. Doyle claimed that he had rights to the cave and its contents, including Floyd's body. The Collins family disputed this claim, arguing that Floyd's body belonged to his family, regardless of where it was located. This legal dispute added another layer of complexity to an already tragic situation. While lawyers argued over property rights and ownership issues, Floyd's body remained trapped in Sand Cave, becoming the subject of a legal battle that seemed to epitomize the worst aspects of the commercialization that had surrounded his death. The body recovery operation was finally completed in April 1925, nearly 2 months after Floyd's death. The process required extensive engineering work to stabilize the cave and create a safe route for removing the body. When Floyd's remains were finally brought to the surface, they were in poor condition due to the damp conditions in the cave and the length of time that had elapsed since his death. Floyd Collins was finally laid to rest in a small cemetery near his family's home, bringing to an end one of the most bizarre and tragic episodes in American history. But even in death, Floyd's story was not finished. The commercialization and exploitation that had characterized the rescue efforts and body recovery operation would continue for years to come, creating a legacy that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. In the years following Floyd's death, Sand Cave became a tourist attraction in its own right. Visitors came to see the location where the famous cave explorer had died, and local entrepreneurs were quick to capitalize on this morbid tourism. Tours were offered of the cave entrance and the surrounding area, with guides providing dramatic retellings of Floyd's final days. Souvenirs and postcards were sold commemorating the tragedy, and the site became a regular stop for tourists visiting the Mammoth Cave region. The Collins family initially tried to distance themselves from this commercialization of Floyd's death, but they eventually found themselves drawn into it by financial necessity. Crystal Cave, the family's own tourist attraction, began featuring exhibits about Floyd's life and death. Visitors could tour the cave that Floyd had explored and developed, and they could hear stories about his cave exploration career from family members who had known him personally. This commercialization of Floyd's memory was troubling to many observers, but it also reflected the complex economic realities facing the Collins family and other cave owners in the region. The publicity surrounding Floyd's death had brought unprecedented attention to the Kentucky cave country, and local businesses were eager to capitalize on this attention. The Collins family, still struggling financially, found it difficult to resist the economic opportunities that Floyd's fame provided. The Floyd Collins story also had a lasting impact on cave exploration and rescue techniques. The tragedy highlighted the need for better safety equipment and procedures for cave explorers, and it led to the development of new rescue techniques and equipment designed specifically for underground emergencies. Cave exploration organizations began requiring more extensive safety training and equipment for their members, and new protocols were established for conducting rescue operations in confined spaces. The media coverage of Floyd's rescue also established new precedents for journalism and mass communication. The story demonstrated the power of radio and newspapers to create national obsessions around local events, and it showed how quickly genuine human drama could be transformed into entertainment and commercial opportunity. The ethical questions raised by the coverage of Floyd's rescue would influence journalism practices for decades to come. Perhaps most significantly, the Floyd Collins story revealed something important about American society in the 1920s. The intense public fascination with Floyd's rescue reflected a hunger for authentic human drama in an increasingly urbanized and industrialized society. For millions of Americans who were becoming disconnected from the natural world and from traditional forms of community, Floyd's struggle represented a return to fundamental questions about courage, sacrifice, and human endurance. The story also reflected the growing power of mass media to shape public consciousness and create shared national experiences. For the first time in American history, people across the country were able to follow a developing news story in real time, creating a sense of collective participation in distant events. This phenomenon would become increasingly common in the decades that followed, but the Floyd Collins story was one of the first examples of how mass media could transform local tragedies into national obsessions. The legacy of Floyd Collins extends far beyond the specific circumstances of his death. His story became a symbol of human determination and courage in the face of impossible odds, but it also became a cautionary tale about the dangers of commercializing human tragedy. The circus atmosphere that developed around Sand Cave demonstrated how quickly genuine sympathy and concern could be transformed into entertainment and profit. Today, More than a century after Floyd Collins' death, his story continues to fascinate and disturb people who encounter it. The basic facts of his rescue and death are well documented, but the broader implications of his story remain relevant to contemporary discussions about media ethics, commercialization of tragedy, and the relationship between individual suffering and public entertainment. Floyd Collins died pursuing his dream of discovering a great cave system that would bring prosperity to his family and recognition to his community. In a tragic irony, his death accomplished both of these goals, but in ways that he never could have imagined. The publicity surrounding his rescue and death brought unprecedented attention to Kentucky's cave country, leading to increased tourism and economic development in the region. Floyd himself became famous throughout America, but it was a fame built on suffering and tragedy rather than achievement and discovery. The Floyd Collins story serves as a reminder of the complex relationship between individual ambition and public fascination, between genuine human drama and commercial exploitation. It shows how quickly tragedy can be transformed into spectacle, and how the line between sympathy and entertainment can become blurred when mass media and commercial interests become involved. As we reflect on Floyd Collins' story today, we can appreciate both the genuine heroism of the rescue workers who risked their lives to save him and the disturbing aspects of the commercialization that surrounded his death. We can admire Floyd's courage and determination, while also recognizing the tragic irony of how his death was exploited for entertainment and profit. The story of Floyd Collins reminds us that behind every media sensation, every public tragedy, and every commercial exploitation of human suffering, there are real people with real families who are experiencing genuine loss and grief. It challenges us to consider how we consume and respond to stories of human tragedy, and it asks us to think carefully about the ethical implications of our fascination with the suffering of others. Floyd Collins entered Sand Cave on February 1st, 1925, in pursuit of a dream that he believed would change his life and the lives of his family members. He died 16 days later, trapped in the darkness he had spent his life exploring. His death became one of the first great media sensations of the modern age, demonstrating both the power and the dangers of mass communication in an increasingly connected world. The story of Floyd Collins is ultimately a story about the human condition, about our dreams and ambitions, our courage and our limitations, our capacity for both heroism and exploitation. It reminds us that even in our most desperate moments, we remain connected to each other through bonds of sympathy and shared humanity. But it also warns us about the dangers of allowing commercial interests and media sensationalism to overshadow the genuine human drama at the heart of every tragedy. If you found this story as haunting and thought-provoking as I did, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the darker corners of human history. The story of Floyd Collins raises questions that remain relevant today about how we treat tragedy, how we consume media, and how we balance our fascination with human drama against our responsibility to treat suffering with dignity and respect. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this story affected you most, and what lessons you think we can learn from this tragic chapter in American history. Until next time, remember that behind every headline and every sensation, there are real people whose stories deserve to be told with honesty, respect, and compassion.